Please rise for the Freedonian National Anthem.
Hello, my name is Cindy Yoakum. I'm a librarian at the State University of New York at Freedonia and coordinator of the annual Freedonia Marxonia. I'm here at the historic 1891 Freedonia Opera House, where we'd originally planned to hear Noah Diamond speak on October 2nd. We're not together in person this year, but we're delighted that Noah has created Home Again, the Marx Brothers in New York City, as a live streaming event from his home in Manhattan under the direction of Amanda Sisk. With thanks to the Hahn Family Freedonia Marxonia Fund and the Carnahan-Jackson Humanities Fund, both of the Freedonia College Foundation, it is my pleasure to introduce author, performer, and Marx Brothers expert, Noah Diamond.
You're supposed to brighten up a place and laugh, clown, laugh. Paint a lot of smiles around your face and laugh, clown, don't frown. Just in your best a la Juba, be a pagliaccio and laugh, clown, laugh.
The Marx Brothers and New York City. What a pair of topics. But where do we begin? Well, of course, we begin on the Lower East Side, where Marxian life first crawled from the primordial ooze of New York Harbor and began its American story. Minnie Marx, who is named Minna Schoenberg, immigrates from Dornum, Germany in August of 1879 aboard the SS Rhine. She is 15 years old, traveling with her parents, Leif and Fanny, who had been itinerant entertainers in the old country. Leif had been in New York since 1877, along with Minnie's sister, Hannah, but he returned to Dornum to retrieve the rest of the family. Also traveling with them are Minnie's younger brothers, Harry and Abraham. Abraham will soon be famous as Al Sheen, vaudeville comedian. Sam Marx, who was called Simon back in Alsace-Lorraine, but known to his loved ones as Frenchie, arrives in New York in 1880 and lives with a cousin on East 4th Street, 6 blocks from Minnie's family on East 10th. The neighborhood at this point is well known as Klein Deutschland, Little Germany, entering its final decades as a thriving Manhattan enclave. Fraternal organizations and beer gardens and dance halls are everywhere. The story sometimes goes that Sam and Minnie meet at a dance hall on 2nd Avenue where he's working as an instructor. Instructor yourself. So these two immigrants meet and fall in love and are married on January 18th, 1885. They move to East 62nd Street, where Minnie gives birth to their first child, Manfred. He dies 6 months later. Over the next decade, Sam and Minnie keep having children and moving. Moving is what you do when the rent is due. By the time they land on East 93rd Street, where they manage to remain for 14 years, there are 4 young Marx brothers, and soon there will be 5. By this time, the former farming community of Yorkville has rapidly urbanized and is on its way to replacing the Lower East Side as the heart of German Manhattan. 9 years later, the uptown transfer is sealed, tragically, when over 1,000 women and children from Little Germany perish in the General Slocum steamship disaster, the most lethal day in New York City history until 9/11. If the family hadn't moved uptown, it's entirely possible that history could have lost some Marx Brothers on the Slocum.
We're gonna have a good time, love me, and the world is mine. Knife and fork, a bottle and a cork, that's the way to spell New York.
It's probably true that the sons of Sam and Minnie Marx could have been born in a city other than New York. And had they grown up, the same people with the same parents in another town, it stands to reason that the character of that town would have imprinted itself on them. But as it happens, New York is Marx Brothers' city. There's a tendency to think of them as Hollywood figures, certainly, and they're not the only Hollywood figures to bear the stamp of New York origins. But most of their career as a team was over before they ever made a film. Yeah, humor risk, I know. They never really became cinematic artists. Their movies are a precious record of their work as performers. And like almost all early talkies, a highly effective international delivery system for the art and attitude of Broadway. The Marx Brothers are New Yorkers, and the characters they play are New Yorkers. New York City is as profound an influence as they ever had, and a key to understanding them. The city is their third parent, and it molded them from wild, scrappy kids to accomplished, responsible, dignified adults. The Marx Brothers' personalities are inseparable from the early 20th century immigrant experience in New York City. The great critic Jose Salas has suggested that the tendency of the Marx Brothers characters to be bad at their jobs, not a great university president, not the best hotel manager, seems kind of connected with their father, the idiosyncratic tailor. It's the spirit of fake it till you make it, get by on moxie and attitude. Frenchie was a tailor because he said he was a tailor. Minnie was a theatrical manager because one day she decided that's what she was. You step off the boat in New York City, you announce with confidence that you are the thing you want to be, and then it's up to you to prove it. And it's against that backdrop that the audacity of the Marx Brothers characters comes into focus.
My name is Sammy Brown, and I just came into town. Saw your ad. You Mr. Lee, say you can make a mint on me.
What do you do?
Dance, sing.
Play a role?
Anything. Say I'm a fine for guys like you, 'cause there's nothing I can't do.
Now, there is another aspect of Marxian identity closely connected with the city, but not always or exactly the same thing. Although, yes, we are now entering the strange rhetorical zone where New York City and Jewish are almost synonyms. Most of what we say about the Marx Brothers as New Yorkers can also be said about them as Jews. It's a seemingly incidental characteristic, but it's impossible to imagine them without it. What we're talking about here is not Judaism, the religion. Indeed, the Marx Brothers were not particularly religious. We're talking about Jewishness, an ethnicity, and, like New York City, a sensibility. It's an attitude, and it leaps out at us if we know to look for it.
How much would you say that the Marx Brothers humor is Jewish humor?
Well, it was not explicitly Jewish most of the time. This was because in Vaudeville you had to tour the entire country, and you might find yourself in a town where they'd never seen a Jewish person. In fact, we had a joke in our Vaudeville act, this must be the Far Rockaway boat, I can smell the herring. Very funny on 93rd Street.
When the Jewishness of the Marx Brothers is discussed, people tend to zero in on a handful of specifically Jewish references in their films. But we'll pass over that. Because it's deeper than that. In a New York melting pot of an act like the Marx Brothers, there are as many Irish references as Jewish ones in their work. But the brothers' characters are Jewish in attitude, especially Groucho. Groucho always seems very Jewish, I suppose because Chico's character is sort of Italian, and Harpo's is sort of from another planet. We might not understand today the degree to which the ethnic identity of the Marx Brothers was a factor in how they were perceived. During their film career, which is the same timeline as the persecution of Jews in Europe, Americans did not yet perceive Jewish people as a category of white people. Beyond this famous Time magazine cover from 1932, the article itself describes Groucho as the prototype of Hebrew wisecrackers. There's a lot more to say about the Marx Brothers and Jewish identity, but that's another cup of chicken soup. For now, let's leave this subject with the words of Leo Rosten from The Joys of Yiddish. Rosten worked with Groucho on Double Dynamite.
A very large part of Jewish humor is cerebral. It is, like Shalom Aleichem, reason made mischievous, or like Groucho Marx, reason gone mad. Jewish jokes drape their laughter on logic, in despair. In nothing is Jewish psychology so vividly revealed as in Jewish jokes. The style and stance of its humor reflect a culture, I think, no less than its patterns of shame, guilt, hostility, and approval. The first riddle I ever heard, one familiar to almost every Jewish child, was propounded to me by my father. What is it that hangs on the wall, is green, and whistles? I knit my brow in thought, and in final perplexity gave up. A herring, said my father. A herring, I echoed. A herring doesn't hang on the wall. So hang it there. But a herring isn't green, I protested. Paint it. But, I sputtered, summoning all my outrage, a herring doesn't whistle. Right, smiled my father. I just put that in to make it hard.
The Marx apartment on East 93rd Street has sometimes been described as a tenement. This is not technically inaccurate. The dictionary will tell you that a tenement is a large building divided into apartments. But the word has very specific connotations, especially in New York. The images conjured up by the word tenement in this context are the photographs of Jacob Riis as presented in How the Other Half Lives. The Marxes are poor. Both parents are immigrants. Money is scarce. The apartment is crowded. But it's not how the other half lives. It's lower middle class. As Trav SD has said, the Marxes had a second-hand piano. Eddie Cantor didn't even have pants. The building at 179 East 93rd Street has changed a lot over the years, inside and out. This photo of the original stoop confirms that this is indeed the building in these early family photographs. And those windows. Those windows are the windows. And if we could go inside 179 on the top floor, we might see not only the lingering ghosts of the wild young Marx Brothers, but the actual space where young Harpo sat at the window with Grandpa Leif Schoenberg and learned to tell time by looking at the clock tower atop Eretz Brewery in the distance. This is where Harpo Marx made his first acquaintance with the concept of time. Eretz Brewery, erected when the Upper East Side was still a rural countryside, is why the streets of the brothers' childhood smelled like beer. The brewery dominated Yorkville for 100 years until its demolition in the 1960s. The clock tower, where he learned to tell time, outliving Harpo by less than a decade. So here we are, folks, home again. The Marx Brothers lived here from 1895 to 1908. They walked in and out of that doorway and onto this street, 93rd Street. The numbered streets in Manhattan somehow become as evocative as the most poetic named streets. This is obviously 93rd Street. Even without looking at the sign is kind of superfluous. Can't you tell? It feels like 93rd Street.
My name is Reggie. I live at 179 East 93rd Street. I've been there for a long, long time. I live on the top apartment on the right in the back, which is the back half of what used to be the Marx Brothers apartment. After the Second World War, they took all the apartments in this building and chopped them into two and made the front part of the apartment a studio, which is that window up on the right on the top. And I live in the back part of that apartment, which you can't see. And many years ago, in that front apartment used to live a little old lady that I used to help sometimes with fixing a broken chair, change a light bulb, things like that. So one day, when she was still alive, she told me a story that there was a knock at the door. And she opened the door and there was standing Groucho Marx. She was very surprised. And he said, do you mind if I come in? And she said, no, of course. So she said, Groucho came in, didn't say much, sat there for about 10 minutes, pulled a chair up by the window, looked out the window, and then at the end of 10 minutes said, thank you very much, and left. And then a few weeks later, a delivery of linoleum came with a note saying that Groucho thought the building was looking a little run down, so he was going to supply some new linoleum for the building. The current landlord renovated the building some more, ripped up that linoleum. I saved a small piece of the linoleum, Groucho's linoleum. Makes me look like a crazy person, but it was Groucho Marx.
We still don't know exactly where the cigar store was, but Harpo says it was on Lexington, and maybe if we squint at these storefronts, we can see young Harpo watching through the window, imitating the facial contortions of the cigar roller, Gookie. They went to school here at PS 86, 96th and Lexington. The school isn't here anymore, but for the most part, even when it was here, they weren't there. What were these streets like when little Marx Brothers were tearing through them like tiny Jewish tornadoes? When the whole neighborhood was Marx Brothers' playground? Where they heard the German, Yiddish, Irish, and Italian dialects they would imitate on stage? And where they learned, as all New Yorkers do, to walk with purpose and confidence, even when you have neither. So Leonard is having fun, getting in trouble, playing the piano. Adolf is doing a little bit less of all of those things. Milton and Herbert are children, and Julius is reading. He's reading Horatio Alger, stories about scrappy city boys living in poverty who, through persistence and determination and luck, find success and wealth and happiness in the expanding frontier of American possibility.
It has been a profitable time for Julius. His excellent natural abilities, stimulated by ambition, have advanced him very considerably in the education which comes from books, while the hours spent in labor on the farm have strengthened his muscles and developed his figure so that he presents a strong contrast to the undersized and slender boy who came from the city streets.
Julius goes into showbiz first, with this Horatio Alger pluck and determination, and the glamorous example of Uncle Al Sheen. Julius answers an ad in the Morning World, which doesn't exist anymore, and hardly do I. And he winds up at a rooftop audition, singing Love Me and the World Is Mine right on top of 281 3rd Avenue, as discovered by Mr. Robert Bader and pointed out to us in 2014 during Marxfest. The building where 15-year-old Groucho Marx tried out for the Leroy Trio still exists. Street level is an excellent Alsatian Bavarian restaurant called Rolf's. Now, this is a beautiful coincidence that in the location of Groucho's first audition, you can get a meal that Frenchie would have approved of. So there's a period where Julius is the one Marx brother in showbiz, with a number of vaudeville jobs beginning in 1905. Milton joins up next. He and Julius become two of the three Nightingales under the direction of Ned Wayburn. Wayburn is an important figure in vaudeville and the author of The Art of Stage Dancing, a real page-turner. But as a manager for the Marx Brothers, Wayburn is at a distinct disadvantage. He did not give birth to any of them. Minnie takes over and is determined to expand the act. With an eagle eye for theatrical ability, she conducts an exhaustive talent search of her own apartment and decides that it's time for Adolf to join the act. The four Nightingales will debut at Henderson's Music Hall, Coney Island, Brooklyn, New York City. Adolf struggles to learn the words to the old anti-slavery song, Darling Nellie Gray. Now, this hapless 20-year-old, physically ill with terror at the prospect of performing before an audience, is literally pushed on stage by his mother and advised to sing as quietly as possible. And he is soon and forever to be hailed as one of the great unique geniuses of American popular culture. But he doesn't know that yet. Wouldn't believe you if you told him. And on this particular evening, he'd rather be anywhere other than Coney Island. Harpo in Harpo Speaks and Groucho in the Marx Brothers scrapbook offer contrasting testimony regarding the precise bodily function Harpo loses control of on stage at Henderson's. But he does not have a good time. Nevertheless, the act is well reviewed by Variety, except for one thing.
They are nice-looking, fresh boys, and there is a certain agreeable youthfulness about their singing. The harmony is true and appealing. The boys, however, are wasting a good deal of valuable time in the exploitation of ineffective comedy and dialogue. The talk is far from funny and makes the turns seem to lag. The greater part of it could be dropped altogether.
By 1908, the act is enough of a going concern that the Marx family relocates to Chicago. Leaving New York could not have been easy, but it did make practical sense. Chicago was the hub of small-time vaudeville, equidistant from the coasts. By 1911, the Nightingales musical act with comedy becomes the Marx Brothers comedy act with music. By 1912, Leonard has joined his little brothers. And by 1914, the schoolroom act has evolved into something else. Home Again, written and directed by Uncle Al, is the culmination of the Marx Brothers' prehistoric act, and it's what takes them from small-time to big-time vaudeville. There is little we wouldn't give to see it. Fortunately, we do have the first-hand testimony of one little boy in the audience, a little boy who turned out to be S.J. Perlman.
The mise-en-scene was the Canard Docks in New York. Garbed in his time-honored claw-hammer coat, his eyes shifting licorishly behind his specs, and an unlit perfecto in his teeth, Groucho erupted on stage. Behind him came Gummo, impersonating his cocksure son, and Harpo and Chico, a pair of shipboard cronies. "Well, friends," he observed, stifling a belch, "next time I cross the ocean, I'll take a train. I'm certainly glad to set my feet on terra firma. Now I know that when I eat something, I won't see it again." Heckled at almost every turn by Gummo, he at length remarked waspishly, "Nowadays, you don't know how much you know until your children grow up and tell you how much you don't know." After considerable horseplay in which Harpo disgorged the entire ship's cutlery from his sleeves and inspected the lingerie of several Zoftig fellow passengers, Chico approached Groucho with hand extended. "I'd like to say goodbye to your wife," he proposed in what was unquestionably the paltriest dialect ever heard off Mulberry Street. "Who wouldn't?" riposted his brother. This boffo ushered in the second scene, laid without any tiresome logical transition at Groucho's villa on the Hudson. The plot structure, to be candid, was sheerest gossamer. Vague reference was made to a stolen chafing dish, necessitating a vigorous search by Harpo of the corsages of two showgirls drifting unaccountably about the premises. But on the whole, there were few nuances.
Although the family lived in Chicago during the Home Again period, the act often brought them home again. During their vaudeville years, the Marx Brothers appeared at dozens of New York City theaters. Almost all of them have been either demolished or repurposed in the last century.
Though the days are long, twilight sings a song of the happiness that used to be. And soon my eyes will close, soon I'll find repose, but in my dreams you're always near to me. I'll see you in my dreams, hold you in my dreams. Someone took you out of my arms. Still I feel the thrill of your charms, lips that once were mine, tender eyes that shine, they will light my way tonight. I'll see you in my dreams. They will light my ever-loving way tonight. I'll see you in, I'll see you in, I'll see you in my dreams, in my dreams, in my dreams, in my dreams.
But the greatest of all vaudeville theaters, against all odds, still exists. It's now a Broadway theater, and it's currently being raised 30 feet in the air, believe it or not, to make room for more street-level retail. But that auditorium, still reverberating with laughter generated by the four Marx Brothers 100 years ago, continues and will continue to exist. And it is still correctly identified as the Palace. Even before they get to Broadway in the theatrical sense, the Marx Brothers are quintessentially Broadway characters, especially in their later vaudeville years, and partly through the influence of Herman Timberg. Timberg is a comedy superstar of the early 20th century who in 1920 replaces Uncle Al as the principal behind-the-scenes creator of the Brothers Act. Timberg writes On the Mezzanine, also known as On the Balcony, and the brothers announce their intention to do away with their former characters. Now and forever, instead of playing Dutch, meaning German, or Hebrew, meaning Yiddish, Groucho will play what he is, a first-generation American wise guy. Timberg's writing is usually set within the world of New York showbiz. He loved to write about managers and critics and actors and chorus girls. And a hallmark of his writing is the use of rhyming, metered dialogue.
I wanted to play a dramatic part, the kind that touches a woman's heart, to make her cry, for me to die. Did you ever get hit with a coconut pie?
Syncopated Broadway jazz patter. Now, the word Broadway means many things. First, Broadway is a street, and it was a street long before New York was a city.
Broadway is a product of pre-European Manhattan, and because it's been here longer than any other human-made feature of the city, it's allowed to break the rules. Broadway violates the grid, cuts an audacious diagonal up the length of the island, creating these irregular blocks. They're triangular, but we call them squares. Union Square, Madison Square, Herald Square, Times Square. And these stops along Broadway are our social and cultural hotspots even today because of where the Lenape carved a path through the woods.
Second, Broadway is a business built around Broadway Theater, which takes place in a number of professional houses, currently 41, with 500 seats or more, located near, or in rare cases on, Broadway, between 41st and 54th Street. And one up at Lincoln Center, I know. This Broadway is the commercial and occasionally the artistic pinnacle of theatrical art in the United States, as well as a metaphor for success and ambition. But there's another Broadway, what we might call cultural rather than religious Broadway. This Broadway refers to the entire world of Manhattan, let's say west of 6th Avenue, north of 34th Street, south of 52nd. But more specifically, not to the location, but the culture which exists there. Broadway culture encompasses not just the theater and theater people, but nightclubs and hotels and delicatessens, and in its heyday, bootleggers and speakeasies. This is Broadway as an adjective and as a mindset, the Broadway Damon Runyon wrote about. In Guys and Dolls, Sergeant Sarah Brown is not looking for some fly-by-night Broadway romance. In Runyon's A Very Honorable Guy, the gang leader known as the Brain, who is based on Arnold Rothstein, declares of a fellow named Feet Samuels, "His credit is ruined forever on Broadway," meaning not in the theater, but in Midtown Manhattan, which, to these Guys and Dolls, is the world. The Marx Brothers were deeply connected to this Broadway. They were denizens of it, or in Runyon's word, citizens, until the day they left for Hollywood, and they remained Broadway characters forevermore in life and in art. Some of their early works are explicitly set in the milieu of Broadway. On the Mezzanine, I'll Say She Is. The action of coconuts and animal crackers takes place outside the city, but Broadway is still the true setting of those plays, as well as their language and attitude and point of view. Monkey Business is about 4 Broadway characters who stow away on an ocean liner and get mixed up with some archetypal Broadway gangsters. There is a term for what these characters are, and although this term does not appear in the Marx canon, I snuck it into my adaptation of I'll Say She Is.
Oh, I should have said even Broadway riffraff.
Broadway riffraff. That's what we're dealing with here, folks. Ragamuffins. Lowlifes, street corner vulgarians who are 10 times smarter, quicker, more resourceful, and more sophisticated than the sophisticates they rankle. Leo Lindemann's Delicatessen, in its original location on Broadway between 49th and 50th, is the unofficial headquarters of the Broadway we're talking about. This is how Harpo describes Lindy's in his book.
I had a home again. I was back with my own people who spoke my language, with my accent. Card players, horse players, bookies, song pluggers, agents, actors out of work, and actors playing the palace. Al Jolson with his mob of fans, and Arnold Rothstein with his mob of runners and flunkies. The cheesecake was ambrosia. The talk was old familiar music. A lot of yucks. A lot of action. Home, sweet home.
I'll Say She Is, The Coconuts and Animal Crackers comprise the classic Broadway trilogy, which contains the essence of the Marx Brothers. These masterworks, of course, ran in beautiful and historic New York theaters: the Casino, the Lyric, and the 44th Street. It will sadden but not surprise you to hear that all 3 are gone. Well, the interior of the Lyric is gone, but the facades on 43rd Street and 42nd Street are original. It's also once again called the Lyric Theater, after years of being called all kinds of things. So, this is very much the view from the street that the Marx Brothers and their collaborators and audiences would have had on their way into the original Broadway Coconuts. I wonder if Groucho, at this fairly early moment in his love affair with the Savoy Operas, ever noticed that 2 of the 3 busts decorating the 43rd Street facade are Gilbert and Sullivan. The third, if you must know, is the composer Reginald de Koven. 1 block uptown, the 44th Street Theater was an appropriate home for Animal Crackers because it had opened in 1912 as the Weber and Fields Music Hall. Today, the only trace of this place on 44th Street is a plaque commemorating the nightclub in its basement, which during World War II was an Allied Forces entertainment venue, operated by the American Theater Wing and known as the Stage Door Canteen. Now, there is a 1943 film about the Stage Door Canteen, and it does include this.
Take your hat off. Can't you see the ladies? perspective.
Come on, take it off.
But sadly, these 30 seconds of footage do not constitute a return engagement for Harpo at the 44th Street Theater because the movie was filmed on some other coast somewhere. However, Harpo had returned to the 44th Street Theater for an appearance in the Friars' Frolic in 1934, so at least we have that to hang on to. But who are we kidding? You know what I want to talk about. The Casino Theater, Broadway and 39th, is already an old house when the brothers arrive in Alsacias in 1924. Built in 1882, it's the first Broadway theater in what is now the Theater District, and the first to be lit by electricity. It had the first public roof garden in Manhattan, and in 1894, it's the home of the Schubert's Passing Show, perhaps the first Broadway revue. In 1898, it's the first Broadway theater to present a musical written by Black Americans, Clarindy, by Paul Laurence Dunbar and Will Marion. In 1900, Florodora at the Casino tantalizes Broadway with the first modern chorus line. In its midst is Evelyn Nesbit. This is where Stanford White first saw her. And if you think I'm going to get into that... But let's spend a minute in this beautiful old house.
That Broadway music, a palpable rage. It's the sun and the stars and the moon. That Broadway music, it's more than a stage. It's the age of the tin and tune. We'll have the thrill of love forever, long as the lights of Broadway shine. When you're out of the money, just say something funny. Forget up and dance in a line. Honey and Broadway will give you a sign. The song is glorious.
Here I am with some of my brothers and sisters from the 2016 cast of Alsacias, posing in the former location of the casino on the 92nd anniversary of the original Broadway opening, May 19th, 2016. From left to right, Matt Walters, some bum who thinks he's Groucho Marx, Melody Jane, Kathy Beale, Seth Sheldon, and Matt Roper. And here are Seth and Matt rehearsing the Tramp Ballet in the footsteps of greatness.
They are gentlemen of infinite jest, and they turn what is intrinsically a 10-cent show into a masterpiece of knock 'em down and drag 'em out humor. They will doubtless soon be hailed by the younger generation as greater geniuses than Michelangelo and Beethoven.
You bet your life. We can't blame the loss of the casino on the decrepitude of the 1970s or the Disneyfication of the 1990s. It's an early casualty of the expanding garment district, demolished in 1930, just as the Marx Brothers are preparing to move to Hollywood. So they never had the opportunity to revisit the casino. However, when they played the casino, Groucho was revisiting Broadway and 39th Street. Diehards will recall that in 1906, an event on this corner featured 15-year-old Julius Marx as a solo vocalist with Gus Edwards' Postal Telegraph Boys.
The truth is, our career mostly took place on the stage. We were touring in Vaudeville. My first job was 1905. In fact, I remember in 1906 performing at a benefit for the victims of the San Francisco earthquake at the Metropolitan Opera House. I mean, the benefit was at the Opera House, not the earthquake. By far the largest and classiest room I had ever played.
Well, that would have been the original Metropolitan Opera House, which was diagonally across the intersection from the casino at Broadway and 39th Street. This building behind me, that's the office building that replaced the original Met in 1967. And the casino stood on the opposite corner, right over there.
Somebody's sweetheart I want.
But it's hard to believe that during his Opera House experience, Julius didn't, at some point, gaze across the intersection at the most arresting and picturesque thing in the area and at least think to himself, my, what a beautiful theater. But if you're ever traveling through time and you find yourself here on the date that Julius sings Somebody's Sweetheart I Want to Be at the Metropolitan Opera House, right here, resist the temptation to meddle with the fabric of time. Don't go over to that little boy and tell him that in less than 2 decades, he will be the toast of Broadway right across the street.
The Broadway period marks the beginning of the Marx Brothers as a fixture of creative and intellectual life in the United States. This is largely due to the influence of a circle of writers and critics in the habit of getting together for lunch at the next great New York City landmark on our tour. And this one still exists. The Algonquin Hotel. Although we are all nervous about the renovations. When the Marx Brothers, especially Harpo, enter the world of the Algonquin Round Table, they meet some of the most important figures in their story. Alexander Woollcott, who wrote the crucial opening night review of I'll Say She Is. George S. Kaufman, who would co-write 3 of the brothers' best scripts. Herman J. Mankiewicz, who would produce some of their best films. But every member of the Round Table was brilliant and accomplished and had some connection to the Marx Brothers.
Sir, one of our elevator men has called my attention to your article in the Herald or Tribune or something, in which you declare that Mr. Julius H. Marx looks like me. Now, Mr. Hammond, I happen to be present also at the opening of I'll Say She Is, and I want to say that if you think Mr. Marx looks like me, then you are even crazier than I have always thought, and I would not like to have my good opinion of you disproved. In the first place, Mr. Marx is just a wee bit terrible looking, and I have had some very favorable comments on my looks from time to time, not even counting those from people who it turned out afterward were speaking of Mr. S.J. Kaufman. Also, Mr. Marx wears a black mustache, and you can appoint one person, and I will appoint one, and together they will pick a third impartial one, and they can search high and low on me without finding a mustache of any color.
There is no wincing possible at the pantomime of Mr. Arthur Marx. It is 110 proof artistry. To watch him during the deluge of knives and forks from his coat sleeve, or in the poker game where he wets one thumb and picks the card off with the other, or, at any moment during the show, is to feel a glow at being alive in the same generation.
Dear Harpo, it was 10 years ago this evening that, thanks to an accidental detour to the casino, I first laid eyes upon you. No other accident I have ever been involved in has contributed so much to my enjoyment of this world. I love you dearly, and think the chances are that I will continue to do so until one of us dies. After you, Alphonse.
The Round Table spawns the essential New York City periodical, The New Yorker magazine, founded by Harold Ross and Jane Grant, and in its early days written largely by members of the Round Table. It also counted Groucho among its earliest contributors. And here we are at an Algonquin event posing before the famous painting by Natalie Asensios.
And now that Harpo that summer begins palling around with the literary set, a running gag begins to run through all of the New York papers all throughout that summer, characterizing Harpo as the brains of the Marx Brothers. And Harpo played that role for all it was worth. He told the New York Review that the green hat by Michael Arlen was glittering but a trifle ostentatious. He tells the Evening Post, I read in my dressing room, and my 3 brothers, who are not studious like I am, interrupt and try to keep me from being the brains of the Marx Brothers. Groucho, having had just about enough of this, fires off a message to Wolcott for his column. There is no brains in the Marx family. And if there was, it certainly wouldn't be Harpo. He was seriously thinking of marrying his first grade teacher because they had been together for 6 years.
The Broadway period provides the Marx Brothers with the last few ingredients required for their greatness. First-rate writers and the greatest scene partner in the history of comedy, the former Daisy Juliet Baker, Margaret Dumont. The character she played had existed in embryonic form in earlier Marxian efforts. But what Margaret Dumont did with it was special. She was, after all, a Marx Brother. The arrival of the brothers on Broadway is also a return to Marx Brothers City. Their desire by the early 20s to transcend vaudeville and succeed on Broadway isn't only, or even mainly, about wanting to be rich and famous. It's about wanting to be home again after 20 years on the road. As I'll Say She Is settles into its run at the casino, the Marxes settle back into life in New York. Harpo finds a place in Midtown, Chico and Zeppo in Richmond Hill, Queens, near Sam and Minnie. And before moving out to Great Neck, Long Island, Groucho lives in this building, right here in Washington Heights, very close to where I'm sitting right now.
And now, if you've got a key you aren't using. Quiet, please. A man sat by the fireplace. The fire, it was out. It was out because the logs were soaking wet. He thought of days when he sat on his mother's knee, which, by the way, was also soaking wet.
The Marx Brothers' success on Broadway conveniently coincides with the dawn of talkies. Their first two films really belong to their Broadway period. Not only are they adapted from Broadway shows, they were filmed in New York City at Paramount's studio in Astoria, Queens. While the brothers were filming Coconuts during the day and early in the morning, they were still appearing on Broadway in Animal Crackers at night. Those are the Broadway Marx Brothers in that movie. Groucho accidentally starts to call Chico Ravelli a couple of times in the Coconuts film, because he was calling him that every night on stage. The Coconuts movie is an archival treasure on many levels. Maybe the first musical talkie, depending on how you define talkie and musical and first. Pre-Busby Berkeleyism, primitive microphones, and soaking wet paper. And Groucho's spoken performance is, among other things, the best available record of first-generation American Jewish New York speech. After 20 years in vaudeville and 5 on Broadway, the Marx Brothers were now to be seen and heard by an exponentially bigger audience. Now they would be everywhere, doing Coconuts forever. And compare that sound with the stilted mid-Atlantic line readings in early talkies. Here was the revolution. For the first time, it was available in big cities and small towns all at once. A gift from New York City to the world. An American music as distinct and expressive as Gershwin's.
Singing, dancing, and entertainment. After the entertainment, there'll be
your eyes. They shine like the pants in the blue suede
Why are the folks? Sunshine. What do you want? What do you want? Expression, sunshine, all the year. You know that suitcase is empty? Let's go ahead and nothing happens. Right this way. You're just an idle rumor. Friends, you and I will walk right into that. Think of the opportunities here in Florida. 3 years ago, I came to Florida without a nickel in my pocket. This is the heart of residential district. Every lot is a stone's throw from the station. They throw enough stones, and you never got double pneumonia. The next time I see you, remind me not to talk to you, will you?
The beginning of a film career is not the most dramatic change the brothers experience in 1929. In fact, it only might be in the top 3. Although I don't think he ever said so directly, I wonder if the depression and insomnia that Groucho begins to experience in the fall of '29 can be traced not only to the stock market crash, but to another event 1 month earlier.
Last week, the Marx Brothers buried their mother. On the preceding Friday night, more from gregariousness than from appetite, she had eaten 2 dinners instead of the conventional one, and after finishing off with a brief, hilarious game of ping pong, was homeward bound across the Queensboro Bridge when paralysis seized her. Within an hour, she was dead in her Harpo's arms. Minnie Marx was in this world 65 years and lived all 65 of them.
The Marx Brothers moved to Hollywood to make monkey business in 1931. The excellence of their first 3 Hollywood films proves that their genius and vitality were not lost in the move. But after those 3, and perhaps the next one too, the brothers' career seems to support Jerry Seinfeld's observation that in New York you get a little more funny every year. Well, Groucho was plenty funny on You Bet Your Life, and he hadn't lived in New York in 20 years. But for the team, and the endlessly fascinating question of their decline, let's not discount the fact that the Marxes were separated from an important wellspring of their comedy. Anarchic wit breeds in the narrow, crowded, incandescent-lit passageways of the city. We understand the Marx Brothers as an urban force, pushing their way through the crowd to be the loudest voices in the throng. New York City remained ever present in their work. About half of their films are explicitly set in or near New York City, at least in part. But all of them contain references to New York or demonstrations of New Yorkism, and of course the Marx Brothers themselves, who are as New York as the Manhattan skyline. There were plenty of visits home again after they decided to go west rather than remain at the circus of life in New York City. But they could have done more. At any time, they could have gone back to New York and starred in a Broadway show. But they were not that hungry. They were happy except for Groucho, and they were comfortable except for Chico. The will to power through 8 shows a week was behind them. In the late 20th century, the tragedy of the human condition causes the world to lose its brothers, at least in their corporeal form. Zeppo, Gummo, and prominently Groucho lived to see the 1970s and the storied Marx Brothers renaissance of that period. Groucho spends time in New York in connection with the 1970 Broadway production of Minnie's Boys. He lavishly praises the performance of the great Louis J. Stadlin and signs a letter enclosed in every playbill during previews. The letter explains that since the show is in previews, the audience is not really in New York, but in Philadelphia. Groucho has another memorable New York experience at the chaotic 1974 re-premiere of the film Animal Crackers at the Sutton Theater. And he visits New York in his later years, staying at the Sherry Netherland Hotel. Here is Charlotte Chandler's description of a walk with Groucho on Fifth Avenue in 1975.
During the walk up Fifth Avenue from 59th Street, almost everyone we passed looked at Groucho with an expression of pleasant recognition. Taxi drivers shouted out, "Hi, Groucho! Be well, Groucho!" He autographed some Wall Street journals and a few copies of the New York Times, some assorted business cards, and a few used envelopes, as well as one leather briefcase which didn't take the ink very well. One fan raced to the Rizzoli bookstore and then caught up with us with a paperback copy of the Groucho letters, which he breathlessly held out for Groucho's signature. He took the book and signed it, and the boy thanked him. "Nothing at all," Groucho responded. "It makes the book worth less."
But the watershed New York City event of the living legend period is his 1972 performance at Carnegie Hall, forever known to fans by the title of its record, An Evening with Groucho. The LP is really an edit, incorporating parts of different performances, one at Carnegie Hall, one at Iowa State University. Nevertheless, the evening of the title, the validating career milestone, was obviously Carnegie Hall, just 36 blocks, less than 2 miles, from the boyhood stoop of 93rd Street. But in those 36 blocks is the adventure of a lifetime.
London is satisfied, Paris is resigned, but New York is always hopeful. Always it believes that something good is about to come off, and it must hurry to meet it. Other places may give you a sweet and soothing sense of level, but in New York there is always the feeling of something's going to happen. It isn't peace, but you know, you do get used to peace, and so quickly. And you never get used to New York.
The afterlife of the Marx Brothers has largely taken place in New York City, where the number of Marxian projects and events in the 5 boroughs since 1977 is impossible to count and growing all the time.
Well, looks like I'm off again. The Russians are in full retreat, and I'm right in front of them.
Oh, Napoleon, when you're away at night, I do nothing but toss and turn.
I don't mind the tossing, but cut out the turning. Well, farewell, Josephine. Caesar had his Brutus, Charles had Cromwell, and I've got rhythm. Whoopee! Tomorrow he's not wearing anything, so get your tickets early.
Did he go? Anybody.
You know, I wish you wouldn't open sardines with my sword. My infantry is beginning to smell like the Lenox Avenue local.
Looking for something?
My sword.
There it is, my darling.
Ah, yes, I see the point. You're not getting your money back.
Sure, he's gone.
Yes, he kissed me goodbye.
You know, I wish you wouldn't open sardines with my sword. Oh, no, we had that, didn't we? Vive la France!
Vive la France!
Vive la France!
It's women like you that make men like me like women like you. Your eyes, Joe. They shine like the pants of a blue serge suit. It's a Napoleon scene.
For me, one of the things that makes New York City feel like home is the magical sense that the Marx Brothers are here, that it's their city and they are its sons. And that sense of hope, that sense of rushing to meet something good that Dorothy Parker was writing about, that too seems like a Marx Brothers feeling, even though it's so sentimental. You know, when writing and talking about the Marx Brothers, I often find myself making this point.
One of the great paradoxes of the Marx Brothers is that they were the most unsentimental artists. And in their great works, you never catch them asking for your sympathy. And yet, we who love the Marx Brothers, and I know there's a lot of us here tonight, fellow citizens of Freedonia, graduates of Huxley College, patients of Standish Sanitarium, welcome. We love the Marx Brothers sentimentally and passionately and with all our hearts.
But like many aspects of my deepening understanding of the Marx Brothers over the last decade, the answer to this question didn't really become clear until I discussed it with Kathy Beale. This is what Kathy said. Their motivation is joy. Marxian behavior, even at its most aggressive and destructive, is an expression of joy. That's why we love them the way we do. Their treatment of Margaret Dumont and other authority figures, it may be disrespectful, but it's not angry. It's really not about sticking it to the man as much as we would sometimes like it to be. Their comedy is anarchic, their characters are vehement, but they're not enraged revolutionaries. They're euphoric revolutionaries. And their darkness is only a parody of darkness. They do what they do for fun. Their motivation is joy. And Maybe it's the profundity of the word brothers, or the sound of their voices, the way they speak to us or don't speak to us. But just as the Marx Brothers have always felt like family, New York has always felt like home. We're going to Queens.
Oh, the desert is the place that you desire, and nevermore will you go. Wah, 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 wah.
So throw another cowboy on the fire and tell him that I'm coming home. I thought I'd never get home. I love you.
Well, here I am with my Marx brother, Seth. We are in a Marxian location neither of us has visited before, at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Queens, and we're going to visit Sam and Minnie. Hey, look, Gottlieb.
Mr. Gottlieb?
Ah.
Oh, wow. They are quite close.
When they came back here, I found in Frenchie's New York Times obituary, it says that Zeppo is on his way to New York and that Groucho and Harpo are already in New York. So they were here. It's one thing, there's lots of places in the city where you can say, oh, the Marx Brothers stood here, you know, at the Palace or something. But I mean, they stood here at two, you know, devastating moments in their lives.
4 years apart.
4 years apart. There are bones in the ground here that crossed the ocean and came to New York.
Mm-hmm.
Stood in the wings in all those theaters.
Mm. Laughed in the seats to get other people to start laughing.
To start laughs, yeah. I assume Gummo was responsible for making the arrangements for funerals and burials and all that kind of family business.
Why? Because he was the manager, or what?
Yeah, he was the manager, and yeah, in a Jewish family, the agent makes all the funeral arrangements. Right. No, but I think I think that was his role in the family. He replaced Minnie as the mother figure. Mm. It's nice, isn't it, that Sam and Minnie's favorite song is blasting from a car.
It's part of the perpetual care plan. The other day, because I've been hanging out a lot by Greenwood, I went to go see the Leonard Bernstein's grave.
Oh, yeah.
Leonard Bernstein, you know, my dad and my mom performed for Leonard Bernstein. So, like, I brought my mom to go visit his grave there. His is a little more elaborate than what we have here, the Marxists. But compared to what else you see in Greenwood, these castles and really, like I think in New York you're going around some of those mausoleums and you're like, I could actually live here.
I could live
nicer
here
than my apartment.
Yeah, it's more spacious than my apartment.
You know, it's quite notable that his is, you know, a little family plot and well taken care of, and a bench under a tree.
Nice.
You know, yeah.
It's nice to see that there are stones on the grave.
Hmm. Yeah, this is interesting. The Talmud mentions that after a person dies, their soul continues to dwell for a while in the grave where they're buried. Putting stones on a grave keeps the soul down in the world. In this world, rather, from, I guess, going up or elsewhere. And a related interpretation suggests that the stones keep demons and golems from getting into the graves.
There is a lizard on the Marx family grave.
That's the Chico's demon.
It's Chico in his reptile form.
Now be a snake.
I don't know how to be a snake.
It's like a worm, but more.
Well, thank you, Minnie, Frenchie, for everything.
Not the tailoring.
Except the tailoring.
Either this is real or it's a beautiful dream. We're sitting on a rainbow eating peaches and cream. If only the dream would last.
I'm lighter than a feather, full of get up and go. You and me together, that's a heck of a show. Next thing you know, it's almost past. When shadows fall and stretch across September, when hope's an ember, then we'll remember we had a ball, and who could ask for more
Then the time we spent in 1924.
when shadows fall and all the fun has faded. Please don't be jaded, keep the past inside. We're in love, we're in electric light. Even Broadway's just for us tonight.
When shadows fall and colder winds are blowing, when tears are flowing, we'll wake up knowing we did it all. So darling, don't be still. Let's go find the thrones, the stars, the songs, the thrill. When shadows fall, our love for one another, brothers and brothers, bright enough to see. We're alive, and what a thing to be. Baby, Broadway's just for you and me.